Hey everybody, hope you had good weekends. So in this video, I'm going to cover some key ideas in Rob Nixon's epilogue, Scenes from the Seabed, pursuant to our first big project, and also discussion post. So if you need Nixon's, excuse me, essay, you can find it in Canvas. Go ahead and log into Canvas, and then you'll find it available as a PDF here. And then you can either read it in the screen reader here, or you can download it as a PDF. But navigating back to today's class plan, kind of wanted to start out a little bit with this question. So what do moments, say for example, like the blight in Interstellar, remember this part? So everybody's at the game, get these like sets of images that because of topsoil erosion and some sort of like fungus blight, the earth is no longer inhabitable. This kind of famous part at the end of Infinity Wars. So despite the best efforts of America's heroes, Thanos is able to snap, right, and kill off half of all life in the whole of the galaxy. Might also say, look at a moment like this, kind of iconic set of imagery. So this is the big finale to Akira, where Tetsuo finally, should I put it, fulfills his destiny, combines with Akira, which is both a sort of life form and a figure for a long history of nuclear energy, nuclear waste, nuclear war, to produce a kind of end of the world scenario. All right, so again, what do these sort of like iconic sets of images have in common, and how do they speak to the Nixon reading? So Nixon would say, just like the coverage of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, or let's see, a camera that filmed the oil spilling out into the Gulf of Mexico during the BP spill, or ways in which the media covered the Ixtoc spill, both in its initial coverage and then in the ways that BP itself used a chemical to clean up the spill. The problems that he wants to outline are the media, both the news and then also fictional media, are really good at covering grand disaster, but very bad at covering what he calls slow violence. So for Nixon, slow violence is the incremental threat that results from warming oceans, from increasingly, and we could add like increasingly drying forests, from the ways that, I don't know, drought affects the growth of certain types of grass, to the bleaching of coral reefs because of the increase of CO2, etc. So, but there's a form of slow violence that's rapid if on a geological scale, but not rapid enough to constitute breaking news, right? So while the media across both like fiction and nonfiction has no trouble covering crisis, Nixon's intervention is to say media, again, both fiction and non, have a lot of challenges when it comes to covering crisis that's instrumental and often invisible. And so he says, So in addition to not being able to cover slow violence, another thing that gets erased across both fiction and nonfiction is the ways in which incremental pollution, emissions, rising temperatures, rising seas at all are more likely to negatively affect people and groups of people who are least likely to have contributed to it. So in the same way that the focusing on, right, the coverage of the disaster in any of these iterations, right, in the snap, in the final culmination in Akira, in the Ixtoc spill, the ways that renders invisible the slow violence that produces the incremental, steady, in this case, break or spill, etc. That those the excuse me, the inability to capture the ways in which these disasters affect marginalized communities and people who are already more vulnerable is a problem that Nixon wants to address. And so one way that he argues that we can redress, or he invites all of us as scholar audiences to address, is to think about ways in which the modes of representation that we use to communicate environmental problems, and especially environmental problems that overlap with equity, can be more inclusive and represent like the unseen. And so one example that he gives is this moment where the president of the Maldives signed a climate bill underneath the water, right? And so this sort of, he calls it an image of figurative activism, does what the disaster cam or the disaster movie can't do, and that is to suggest through its modes of representation that the Maldives, an island nation, most threatened by rising oceans and least contributing to the rise of those oceans, doesn't have time to mess about with different types of, activism, or not activism, different types of arguments, because by the time they can sign legislation that would help, it'll be too late. Okay, so what assumptions about the future enables the violence to continue? So according to Nixon, and again, if this is a class thinking about what sorts of figures can we use to make better choices in the contemporary so that we have a future that is not filled with disaster or underwater. So Nixon says both this focus on disaster as opposed to the slow violence or the slow accretion, etc., that underwrites that disaster, makes it so that the industry, the oil industry, or other industries have little motivation for making advances to prevent blowout or to clean up technologies. And so he argues that the standard operating procedure remains: it's cheaper for us to improvise when stuff happens than to make plans in the present to ensure that that doesn't happen. So he calls this way of operating both within, he finds it both within capitalism and then also specifically within like oil and petroleum production, is that part of the problem is that he calls this disaster optimists are typically engineers who take a narrowly technological perspective, observing only how disaster can drive design. But unless the political climate under which innovative design operates is subject to an environmental justice overhaul, such innovations will have limited effect or indeed never be implemented. Without political pressure or quick profitability, what is there to motivate corporate will? And so he suggests that a component of the work that we can do, right? So again, if we are working to affect better futures, there are lots of ways, obviously, that we can do it. But one way he suggests is... Some writer activists are fly-by-night operators. Others are in it for the long haul, as they strive to bring an attention-grabbing urgency to issues that might otherwise be marginalized by technological, neurobiological, and political forces of inattention. Whether our era of heightened connectivity and intensified distraction compounds or alleviates destructive environmental short-term thinking will be shaped in large measure by the politics of the commons. Will the vast insurgent digital energies directed at defending the information commons help mount an equally spirited defense of the commons in its oceanic, atmospheric, or terrestrial forms? So that is all to say that Nixon invites us to engage in the types of rhetorical, visual, oral, electronic, etc., rhetorical production that can communicate to broad audiences not only the flash bang of the apocalyptic disaster, but the slow violence that produced that disaster. Because, like the movies, right, that I cited show, by the time the disaster occurs, it's too late. And then, like Cohen talked about that we read last week, the sort of figure of of apocalyptic disaster can produce in audiences either resignation or sort of problematic responses in terms of preservation. So, okay, that's it for that.